Okay, welcome to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is on legal, ethical, and professional issues. Page 223. So, learning objectives, difference between laws and ethics, describing some of the laws, the ones that are relevant. The organizational things you need to be aware of, and privacy. Some organizations even have a chief privacy officer to take care of those things. The opening case is pretty cool. I mean, this guy first of all, he was dumb enough to leave a thumb drive at a coffee shop. And the second, he left evidence that he was, selling the information to a competitor or something. So introduction, page 224. So understanding the organization's role in legal and ethical responsibilities. So obviously we're talking about litigation and punitive damages. If you do something stupid, it could hurt you. Now, if it's a law, well, then they come after you with criminal offenses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's just an ethical violation, well, then we're talking about reputation and we're talking about civil lawsuits, and yeah, you know how this thing works. So it's really all about the kind of a balance between the kind of liberties that you're allowed and the protection of and safety, right? I mean, there's a goofy quote. I think this was originally attributed to like Benjamin Franklin or something, but those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty or safety. Trust me, the original quote's a lot better than that. But anyway, the point is that if you give up a little bit of this, you probably don't deserve the other. So laws, that's where you call the police. I mean, this is straightforward stuff. The police and the courts handle that kind of thing. But ethics is just the political mores, so to speak. For example, if I was to have an affair with somebody while I'm married, there's not really a law against having an affair, but it's clearly something that's unethical. Okay, cool. All right. So liability and the need for counsel. Can a company still be liable if there is no crime? Well, if you use the word liable to mean in the broader sense, having punitive actions taken against you, yeah. So liability is the legal and financial responsibility for an act. If you did something incredibly stupid, maybe you didn't violate any laws, but you did something there's no law that says, I need to back up my data. But if you don't do it, and your company goes under, then yeah, you could have civil lawsuit that says you didn't do your due diligence. Okay. And of course, restitution is about, okay, you need to pay me back for, what was lost, right? Okay. So there are two parts to that. I've used these terms a lot, due diligence and due care. So let's just zoom in a little bit closer one more time. So the definitions in like Google are pretty good, but they're kind of generic. The terms I'm using now are specific to IT. So due care means the average person knows what needs to be done and does it. Okay, a reasonable person in that job, I'm not talking about just rank and file. I'm talking about each person in their individual job. So if you're an IT person, you should know what the risks are and you should know how to take care of them. Okay. Due diligence, it has to do with research. You're going to have to go further than just doing your job. You're going to have to go and say, is this working? So in my way of thinking, these two terms are separated by due care is I know what needs to be done and I did it. And then due diligence is I've done some research and I've determined that this was sufficient. Okay. All right. So what's the opposite of due care, due diligence? If you were being taken to court, what term would they use? Well, it's not necessarily a legal term, but they would say it was negligence. That you didn't do what a reasonable person would do, expected to do, so you were negligent. Okay. So by the way, I like questions about due care and due diligence, so you're probably going to see those. Okay, on page 225, they talk about policies versus law, and we mentioned this before about if in order for a policy to be enforced, then there's these things you have to do. Remember that. So the first one is you have to disseminate. In other words, It can't be a secret. It can't be an unwritten. It has to be out there. It has to be published. They have to be able to review it, demonstrate that the document was able to be read. And then comprehension. We're talking about languages and jargon and abbreviations and acronyms and all the rest of that stuff. So technical acronyms in a policy document, may not work all that well. You're going to have to be very clear. And then compliance. So you have to have some way of saying that, yes, they agreed to it. Now, some of this could be subtle. It could be you have to agree to this, otherwise it's a condition of your employment. You must agree to this. So therefore, you really don't have much of a choice. You go, okay, whatever. And then uniform enforcement. You cannot have a policy that applies to you but doesn't apply to senior management. Ooh, that'll get you caught. If you were to have some sort of negative, performance review saying, shame on you for doing that, and you said, yeah, but your boss did the exact same thing and he didn't get punished, then you go up, and you could take him to court easy and win. Okay, the types of laws. Now, most of you guys know some of this stuff. You remember the 3 branches of government, right? Right? I would hope so. So constitutional law, that's pretty straightforward. We could be talking about U.S. Constitution or state constitutions, but in broad sense, constitutional law. Statutory, which is basically from the legislative branch. Okay, they're coming out and saying, here's the rules we want you to follow. Typically, we're talking about, laws and regulations, right? And so there are different branches underneath that, if you were to look at a taxonomy of this. Civil law, which is really between 2 parties, so, divorce and that kind of stuff. And then public, which means, the state is, going after a person or an organization, one of the two. So civil law is between 2 people or between an individual and the public, or in other words, I could file a civil lawsuit against the EPA, for example, that kind of thing. And then criminal law, everyone knows for criminal laws. That's between the state and a particular individual. So regulatory, this is generally from the executive branch. So like the Army is part of the executive branch, and they come up with regulations. Okay, now regulations don't hold the exact same weight as a law, but they could have penalties against them as long as you follow those 5 rules about how this thing's supposed to work. Well, then that could be almost as deadly as having a law. And then case law, and case law is kind of important on all these categories, because you may have a law on the books that everyone goes, oh geez, you got to be kidding. And case law after case law is basically just thrown that thing out. So it may still be on the books, but no one is trying to enforce it. So that's the interpretation of laws by precedents. Okay. So relevant laws, page 226. So historically, we've done fairly well in security legislation. I'm not certain we've kept up. I think there's other organizations that have probably gone beyond us now. Okay. Just saying. I mean, like the European Union has a lot tougher laws than we have. I mean, the ones I always talk about is, in the U.S., am I required to control access to users' data, like their credit card numbers or Social Security? Is there a law that says I have to encrypt that data to keep it safe? No. Is there one in the EU? Yeah. Okay. So let's just go through this. So, general computer crimes. So it started out with a normal crime conducted over the computer is still a crime. I mean, that sounds kind of obvious, but that's how it all got started. So it could be like for commercial advantage or financial gain or furtherance of another cause or whatever. But if you're extorting information or ransomware, those kinds of things. So there's this crazy story about the Patriot Act, and this is a highly controversial issue, and I'm not trying to get on the side of any political party, for heaven's sake. But in 2001, the Patriot Act. So this is it authorized the warrantless surveillance of ordinary citizens to deter terrorist activities. That was the idea. And Section 215 basically allowed them to collect phone call data, not the transcripts of the phone call, but every phone call that was ever made, to, from, and how long. Okay? This thing got extended several times, and finally expired in 2015 and was replaced with called the Freedom Act rather than the Patriot Act. And it kind of calmed things down a little bit. A lot of people were kind of concerned about, privacy-related things. Up to this point, you had to have probable cause, and had to have a search warrant, and you would, then you could go in and check somebody's email and, look at their phone records and all the rest of that stuff. But the Patriot Act basically said they gave them broad brush to just go in and do whatever types of electronic searches they wanted. It was kind of a wild time. The Security Acts of 1987, now we're back to anything you do that's a crime in real life is also a crime on the computer. I know. So basically, that was setting up rules for the federal government to do. And it's the one that created NIST. Actually, they renamed it. It already existed. And then FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act, basically, again, for the federal government only. It talked about, different, levels of security classification and periodic risk assessments. Basically, the stuff from Chapter 5 is if you're in the legislative branch, in the executive branch, you're basically required by law to do risk assessments. Yeah, all that stuff we did. Okay, now, is there such a law for, Macy's or Target or, Walmart? Do they have a law that says they must do risk assessments? No. Should there be? Probably. Privacy on page 227. So this is kind of another big and controversial issue. So can a company collect your shopping data and sell that data to someone else? Well, it's being done. I mean, if you had tracking cookies on your machine and you visited sites, the story I love to tell, I've probably told you this before, I'm working on a throwaway Gmail account. My sister sends me an email that says, I had to take her dog in to the vet because it had hemorrhoids. And I wrote her a note back saying, hemorrhoids? I didn't even know dogs could have hemorrhoids. And I'm not kidding you. It was like probably 15 seconds later, I got a pop-up ad for Preparation H. Like, yeah, they sold my data to an advertiser. Yeah, they did. Okay. So there's some very specific terms here you're going to have to know. And this is something you might have to memorize because the terms are very similar and it could get confusing. It's aggregate information and information aggregation. Okay, those two are separate terms, but let's just go through them. Okay, so aggregate information is blinding. In other words, when I grade your exams, for example, I have the machine not show me the person's name. In other words, I have no idea who it is I'm grading. I just go through and I'm grading all the stuff, and I hit the grade and I go to the next one. Okay, so I don't know who it is. That's information blinding. So aggregate information. So it could be personal information, and it's perfectly legal to do this. In fact, you want me to do this. You want me to have aggregate information, right? Okay, so if I take a bunch of data of you and strip out all your names, I can come up and say the average age of the people in the classroom is, okay, that's information blinding. I've taken all this stuff, aggregated it together, but you can't go back and say that record right there belongs to me. Okay, so it's a good thing. Hey, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark. You guys know how this works.